सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The Ayatollahs called it the Devil's Feast. The great rulers of the world all assembled around a table in the ancient Iranian city of Persepolis to gorge themselves on quail eggs with caviar, mousse of crayfish tails, imperial peacock, 60-year-old champagne and vintage cognac. The catering was by Maxims of Paris, the tents sourced from a Swiss interior design firm, and the toiletries where else but from Guerlain. The poorer sections of the town had been hidden away behind high walls, one visitor later observed, and local beggars had been chased away by the secret police. For the most part, the world made its peace with this petroleum dollar-fueled excess. The avant-garde composer Yanis Xenakis, a battle-hardened communist who had almost been blinded in combat fighting British tanks during the revolution in Greece, even produced a special sound and light show for the 1971 Persepolis celebrations. 8 years later though, Iran's urban poor and middle class united to rebel against the lurid decadence of their rulers. They draped themselves in the dull monochrome of theocracy instead. Through its decades in power, the Islamic Republic has seen off multiple challenges to its authority. Ethnic mobilizations in the early 1980s, urban riots in the 1990s, reformist youth movement in the 2000s, and economic protests that have run almost every year since 2017. The explosion of anger since the killing of student Mahsa Amini in police custody, though, is different. Amini, as you know, was jailed for participating in protests against the hijab, which began in September. But her memory has powered the deepest challenge the regime has yet had to confront. 434 people, including dozens of children, are estimated by independent organizations to have been killed and tens of thousands arrested. Ethnic Kurdish demonstrators in Bukan and Baluch Sunnis in Zahedan have stormed government buildings. And it's not just minorities. Even elites linked to the regime seem to have been seized by anger. Football players, as you may have seen, refused to sing the national anthem in Doha. Film star Taraneh Aludousti, who earlier said Iranians were millions of prisoners, posted pictures of herself without a veil, defying the regime. Even bazaar merchants, the bedrock of the regime's power base since 1979, closed their stores in Tehran, Mashhad and Isfahan. A wing of the seminary in Qom, the regime's theological powerhouse and childhood home of the Islamic Republic's founding patriarch Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was torched to the ground. The story of how the anti-hijab protests have catalyzed a generalized rebellion against the regime is entwined with how women's bodies came to be fetishized in Iranian politics. The women who contributed to the revolution were and are women with Islamic dress, he told the journalist Oriana Falaci. Not elegant women, all made up like you, who go around uncovered, dragging behind them a tail of men. The Islamic State, as Khomeini saw it, was at its core a gender apartheid state. For the regime of the Shah of Iran, the unveiling of women, which often was secured through brutal violence, was a metaphor for the wider process of westernization he had sought to push through. The Ayatollahs also made the veil the symbol of their political project. The first postage stamp ever issued of an Iranian woman consisted of a round face set inside a black oval shell. The background contained a gun. The new woman was not a traditionalist Muslim woman, but a desexualized vessel for bearing the values of the Islamic Revolution. Large numbers of women, disillusioned by westernization that had in practice meant immiseration, supported this new ideology, scholar Hamide Sedgi records. Led appropriately by a phalanx of men, hundreds of women marched in Tehran to vow death to the unveiled woman and her cowardly husband. To some women from poor neighborhoods, Sedgi suggested, participation in these kinds of religious enforcement squads might also have offered a sense of agency and power over elite women who had always lorded it over them. Fatwas ordained by clerics institutionalized hijab by variously mandating the use of the all-enveloping chador, the loose-fitting rupush tunic, and the rusari scarf. The law of qisas or retribution gave legal form to these mandates in 1983, condemning women who defied the rules to 74 lashes. The law also mandated that the testimony of a woman in adultery cases was worth just half of that of a man. Through the coming years, gender apartheid hardened. From offices to sports complexes and even medical facilities, public infrastructure was segregated by gender. Educational institutions also saw much the same process. Even in public transport, women were assigned separate seats, at the back. The consent of husbands was required for married women to travel, and single women were denied the right to study overseas. From at least 2007, evidence emerged that the regime was congealing into a kind of theocratic nightmare. That year, Iran's Supreme Court upheld the acquittal of militia members who admitted to having killed individuals they believed to be engaged in crimes like drug peddling, extramarital sex, and prostitution. To kill to enforce Islam, the Supreme Court held, citing a constitutional provision, was legitimate. There had been several other similar cases, one involving the hanging of a teenage girl for chastity crimes. Efforts to ease the enforcement of these rigid theocratic norms began under President Mohammad Khatami, who ruled from 1997 to 2005. The rise of the authoritarian Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, though, saw those gains reversed as the regime sought to consolidate its authority with religious nationalism. Late in 2017, the regime's social base began to disintegrate amid an economic crisis, brought on in part by Western sanctions against Iran's nuclear weapons program. Fuel price hikes in 2019 led to widespread attacks on government offices and banks, as well as the looting of supermarkets. The 1/3 of Iranians who continue to live under the poverty line, despite the regime's promises to ensure equality, had lost patience, journalist Mariam Senei observes. The latest protests have opened up deep cracks within the establishment. In several cities, protesters have chanted harsh, even obscene slogans against the country's supreme religious leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Elements in the hard right establishment have tried to signal a willingness to reform in a bid to calm the crisis. Ali Raza Panahian, a cleric close to Khamenei, has called for greater popular participation in government. The chief of Iran's judiciary, Ghulam Hussein Mohseni Ejei, and the security boss, Ali Shamkhani, have even met with prominent reformist politicians like Fatemeh Rakei. It may be too late for reconciliation, Rakei said after these meetings, but we still have time to stop bloodshed and violence. This isn't a sentiment, though, that everyone shares. One high-ranking cleric, the pro-reform Ayatollah Asadullah Bayat Zanjani, has asserted that, I quote, demonstrators have the right to defend themselves against agents in civilian clothes who attack them. Ethnic minorities are also increasingly alienated. Abdul Hamid Ismail Zahi, spiritual head of Iran's Sunni population and a long-standing regime supporter, alleged the government I quote, had resorted to threats and intimidation rather than asking for forgiveness from the family of the victims and the wounded. The Shah lives in a morbid dream world Khomeini had proclaimed early in 1979 as the revolution began. Within days of his statement, the light of the Aryans, as the king called himself, left Iran for the last time, claiming to be traveling for a holiday. Scholar Ali Ansari, in A Majestic History of Modern Iran, recorded that 2,781 people had been killed in the bloody year that preceded the Shah's exit. Following a curious speech claiming leadership of the rebellion against his state, Ansari writes, the king ordered the arrest of many establishment figures in a desperate attempt to hang on to power. The end result was his own elite lost faith in him, and he certainly didn't get respect from protesters on the streets. Iran's ruling establishment this time will likely fight to the end. Locked in confrontation with the West, the regime's leaders know they are on the edge of a devastating threat to their personal position. The theocratic circle which rules the country, along with the military, has no escape route overseas. Inside the military, some are already warning that they won't give up without a bloodbath. This ominous sedition will bring no happy ending to you, the head of Iran's powerful revolutionary guards, General Hossein Salami, warned protesters this week. To many experts, though, it's clear coercion alone will not succeed in cowing a youth cohort that's had enough. The eminent economist Mohsin Renani, himself participating in the protests, has argued that, and I quote, the government is trying to stop a flood by shooting at it, thinking that bullets can stop the deadly torrents. The protests might be temporarily crushed, but Iran's people have begun an irreversible process of tearing off their theocratic veil. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint. Thank you for watching Security Code.